I'm zooming into you from tiny little flat in Glasgow, and I have to apologise. I was just saying to Toya, in the bedroom next door, we're getting new carpet and new painting, so everything from that room is right here. So this is not the most professional of backdrops that I would normally have. My apologies for it looking so cluttered, but really, really excited to meeting you and discussing, and wonderful, so special to see some familiar faces too on this call. So yeah, thanks for being here. So I'll just very, very briefly tell you a little bit about what I've been up to over the last few years to give you a sense of, I guess, our approach to this mammoth question of economic system change. My doorway into it, I think most people come to the question around how do we change the economy? How do we make the economy more humane, more sustainable from different doorways? They come at it from different perspectives. And I think that's it. Everyone sort of meets in this beautiful space in the middle. My doorway into it was from the beyond GDP space. Over 10 years ago, I was working with Oxfam, the international NGO, and I was working at the time on their Scottish project. So this was a really small part of Oxfam's work, focusing on poverty and inequality in this extraordinary wealthy country of the United Kingdom. And so I was focusing on poverty and inequality in Scotland, and really it just was so apparent working with the community groups and the partners that Scotland had had decades of economic growth, and yet it was also a country where health inequalities were getting worse. There are parts of Scotland, Glasgow even, just the other side of the city, where life expectancy is going down amidst, this is 10 years ago, amidst all this sort of wealth, where you're getting huge inequalities in terms of educational attainment, pretty horrible impact on the environment, socioeconomic gradient in terms of quality of local environment as well. And so what really, and I brought that sort of Oxfam lens of the sustainable livelihoods approach that just really, it's an international development theory, you'll probably know iterations of it. Essentially that communities, countries, families need a breadth of resources. And what that work really revealed, that Scotland as a country was really narrowly focused on GDP growth, and it wasn't paying enough attention to the other sorts of resources that communities needed. And so at Oxfam, we tried to create something to get basically politicians to look more broadly. And so we created a participatory measure of progress, something called the Humankind Index, tiny, tiny little budget, lots and lots of rough edges, lots I would do differently if I was to do it again. But essentially we went round to groups who almost by definition whose interests aren't being served by the mainstream policymaking process, and said to them, what is it you need to live well in your community? And that yielded a set of priorities that we weighted and we matched to available data sets. If any of you want to talk in depth about measures of progress and the geekiness around that, happy to come back to that in questions, but I'll try to stop it there. But what happened with this thing called the Humankind Index is it really spoke to a lot of different interests. So we had unions involved, we had church groups involved, we had housing groups involved, we have refugee groups involved, we had the public health experts involved, we had businesses involved. And so we're pushing this at Parliament, and it got debated in the Scottish Parliament. And what happens is when you get a certain number of members of Parliament sign up, you have to have the relevant minister respond. And so this was about essentially challenging Scotland's document called the National Performance Framework that focuses on GDP growth, essentially. And we were saying we need that to change. So the finance minister responded, and at the end of the debate that went into extra time, he then said, okay, we will look at the National Performance Framework. And I remember walking up from the Scottish Parliament up to the Waverley train station, and it was sort of typically cold, wintry Scottish day, thinking, well, that was nice. Let's see what happens. But within weeks, they had created a round table that was working on further iterations of this National Performance Framework. And it was refreshed, and the new version came out in 2018, and at its center, it has well-being, it has love, it has addressing wealth inequalities. It's not perfect. I think they need another version because it's still got economic growth in there, but it's starting to move the conversation on. So that was my doorway into these discussions. And at the same time, I was working with someone who you probably all know of at Oxfam, Kate Raworth, who was just doing the very initial draft of the discussion paper of what became donut economics. And so I was working with her in the research team. And once you've read her paper, you start seeing the world through donut eyes. Jen, can I take it as given that most people on this call will know what donut economics is, or should I do a quick explanation?
Maybe a quick explanation would be good.
Okay, sure. So Kate was like me working at Oxfam, and this was at the time at some of your colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Centre were coming up with the Planetary Boundaries idea, and Kate was part of those conversations in a way, and she was looking at that idea of these 9 planetary boundaries, and she said, well, we recognise that at Oxfam. We see the impact of environmental destruction setting back human development. We see that impact, but there are no people there. And so, she took out this pen and said, let's draw the inner layer. So you get the planetary boundaries on the outside, and she drew the social foundation on the inside. And the implication being is that we need economies to operate in a way that respects both, that doesn't breach beyond environmental limits, but also lifts humans around the world up above a minimum level of attainment. So it yields this donut shape. And so it's quite a different vision for the economy. So Kate then left to write the book that's become this amazing bestseller. And I picked up some of the work around mapping. How do we downscale that idea in a global sense of a donut? What's that mean for countries? And so we were mapping different countries to Scotland. We did one for Wales. We did one for South Africa. We did one for Brazil, which wasn't published for various reasons. But we're sort of looking at how do you translate this down to countries? And so I was carrying forward this idea of, we need different measures of progress. We have to really think about particularly the economic models of the global north, because they're the ones that are putting so disproportionate impact on the planet and quite literally eating up ecological room for the rest of the world, for communities that Oxfam's more known for working with. And then at the same time, and Jen, this is much more than 5 minutes, I'm really sorry. At the same time, I got introduced, Jen, by one of our mutual friends, Donnie McClurkin. I had this, I don't know if it was a Twitter blind date or how you describe it, but I'd never met Donnie, who runs the Post-Growth Institute. And we were tweeting, and he just said, we had a chat, and he said, you need to meet this guy, Jeremy Williams. And Jeremy was an author living just north of London. And I went down for various meetings, and we made time to have lunch. And so I was talking to him about this sense that we really need to focus, if we care about global justice, we need, and I was sitting at, in Oxfam at the time, we need to really look at those economic models of the global north. And I was thinking about Scotland's economic model and the UK's economic model with its GDP orientation, and it's just faster economic growth as these economies that are designed for and dependent on more and more economic growth. And Jeremy, almost as an aside, said, well, those sorts of countries, they need to recognize that they have arrived. And there was something really powerful about that idea of arrival. And as someone whose family is the other side of the world, that idea of coming home and the different mindset and the different sense of peace that when you've arrived, it really spoke to me. And I said, well, Jeremy, we should write a blog on this. We never wrote a blog because it became a discussion paper. And then we never wrote the discussion paper because it became a book. And so the book is The Economics of Arrival. And it really talks about this idea that it's time to enable us to ask this question: has economic growth done its job? When it's being used well, and that's a hugely important caveat, when it's been used to invest in collective institutions, in health and education systems, when it's been directed towards those who need it most, it can deliver some benefits in terms of social progress. But you very quickly enter stages where those benefits start to tail off. You get diminishing marginal returns, and actually to keep pursuing economic growth, to keep trying to squeeze economic growth out of countries beyond the point of arrival, can actually lead to what we talk about in the book as this idea of failure demand. It's sort of a social policy term equivalent to what ecological economists would talk about as defensive expenditure, where you basically have to spend money to heal and repair and clean up and fix the damage that you've created in the pursuit of economic growth. So it's this sort of terribly inefficient system of sort of a dog chasing its tail, that we're trying to get more growth that then creates demand for resources, and we have to then grow more to be able to fulfill those resources. So that's part of the conversation. And then at the same time, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance was created. And this is an organization that I describe as having many mothers, in the sense that it's came from a lot of different organizations who, in their own different ways and their different spheres of influence, had all been working on economic system change. They were scholars who were building the evidence base of why we need a different sort of economy if we're going to have a chance of dealing with the multiple crises facing the world. These were activist groups, these were networks, these were all sorts of folks, and they just, in each of their different way, had been working relatively separately on this question of economic system change. And they just got to the point where they said, if we're really going to make an impact here, we need to collaborate like we've never collaborated before. And so that's where the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, that rather nicely shortens to We All, rather appropriately, was created. And I'll tell you that the term wellbeing economy, we weren't really thinking we need this new grand narrative. We almost wanted a sort of a nice, gentle holding term that all the different pieces of the economic system change jigsaw could feel at home in. So a place where those people working on economic democracy or local economies or community wealth building or degrowth or circular economy or, citizens' basic income, and all those sorts of people who all bring a contribution to economic system change could feel at home. But so we sort of wellbeing economy felt positive, it felt inclusive. It wasn't an agenda in itself, it was more, these are different pieces of the puzzle. But actually, in hindsight, we've been encouraged very much to be assertive about what wellbeing economy is. So we've tried to keep it fairly general and sense inclusive. But essentially, when we talk about a wellbeing economy, we describe it as social justice on a healthy planet. It's, that simple. It's going to require a hell of a lot of changes to bring that about. And that's where all the different members come in. So it's a membership organization. We've got over 200 different institutions, a load of scholars, young people, and really excitingly, some local hubs are emerging, so that we have these lovely hubs calls where you have people from the Scotland hub, the Canadian hub, hubs merging in Uganda and New Zealand, in the Netherlands, and so on. It's just beautiful. And they're sort of local manifestations of that global picture. And crucially, it's about focusing on economic system change, not being content to deal with some of the symptoms and the fallout, saying we need to be bolder than that. And also working collaboratively, cross-sectorally, so not just environmentalists or not just business owners or not just focusing on government, really saying we need everyone around the table for this. And we need to create partnerships and create dialogue and create new narratives with those different sectors. It's very much about supporting the pioneering activities that's already happening. And so we talk about our role as amplifiers, and we, as a team, our nickname for our team is the AMP team. And we take that very seriously, about really wanting to shine a light on the work that's already going on to embody the sorts of changes that we need. Because, quite literally, that proves the possible. It demonstrates that this is possible and preferable to have something different. And so we need to really support that work. We're also and I'll finish in a minute, Jem, where we also work on the knowledge base. There is so much written out there, whether it's loads of academic journals, whether it's grey literature or evaluation reports, but it's fairly disparate and hard to navigate. So we're working to try and synthesize that to make it accessible and compelling and just easy for people to access. We're also working on the narratives. How do we tell this story so that everyday people find it exciting and something they want to engage with and then vote for at elections? So we've just released a site called Stories for Life, and it's stories.life, led by storytellers and creative folk to really come up with a suite of products and phrases and how do we talk about the economy in ways that are exciting. So I'd all encourage you. It's there as a gift to anyone who wants to work on this. So thanks, Toya, for putting that in. So please do dive into that and utilize it. And it's there for you to use. And then the other piece that maybe we can come back to is we instigated the Wellbeing Economy Government's partnership, We Go. And this started off, and I could talk about it a bit more, but I'll just very briefly, this started as an idea to essentially look, well, and they're meeting today here in London, the G7 group of countries where the entry ticket is how big's your GDP. And yet we know in the 21st century, GDP is a flawed measure of progress. We need governments that are aligning to much bolder and more, goals that are more aligned with what people on planet need. And so We Go, the Wellbeing Economy Government's partnership, is about governments linking together to learn from each other, to share their experiences and to collaborate around putting wellbeing economy principles into policy making, and particularly economic policy making. So it's the Secretariat sits with the chief economist at the Scottish government. So they lead it now alongside New Zealand, Iceland, Finland and Wales, and there's a few other governments that are part of those conversations, and we hope we'll be able to announce in the coming months and years a few more governments joining We Go, because if we get 2 more, then we've got the We 7, and then eventually maybe we'll get to the We 20 and keep going. I'll stop there, Jen. That's way more than I promised you I'd talk for. My apologies.
No need to apologize at all, Katherine. It's so much that you've been doing, and it's such impressive work. And I can say, as somebody who's been sort of just 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, that it's such powerful work, the way that it's been able to work on these multiple levels, all the way from governments down to local activist groups. So it's impressive, and I think it's such important work that you guys are doing. So one question for you in this long journey, looking back from your beginnings with these wellbeing economy measurements in Scotland, all the way through your book with Jeremy, and now with We All, and the AMPS team, which I love the name of that team. What would you say, are there some patterns that you've noticed in terms of how this change is taking place and how it takes shape maybe in different places? Are there patterns to that you've noticed?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd love to hear others' thoughts on where they've felt change has effectively emerged, because I think there's all sorts of different stories and different approaches. But I think for me, one thing at least from my personal window into it, and I wouldn't claim that this is anything more than that, but I think just building relationships really, really matter, and building trust, particularly with the audiences that you're needing to reach. And I'm thinking particularly about decision makers within the Scottish government. How do you sort of influence them to the point that when you suggest something as wacky as what became We Go, they're ready to actually take that on board. And so in a way, the history of We Go massively predates that first conversation when I suggested it to them. It was really many, many years of building the appetite. So this is, you're really trying to change the terms of the debate in Scotland. So a lot of talks, a lot of writing, a lot of working with other colleagues in Scotland to move the debate on from just looking at the symptoms and looking at how things like poverty and destitution and those health inequalities that I mentioned at the beginning are in many ways connected to the economic system and what we define as progress, and how we really trying to sort of take that conversation away from just blaming individuals for their poverty. And you have narratives around people are experiencing poverty because they drink too much or they have too many kids, and just really trying to shift that debate. And certainly not me on my own, I'm not making any claim, but I think linking these to the economy and helping folks in different quarters connect their work to the way the economy operates can move the debate on, and hence then build that appetite in a sort of a policy community, I guess, so that politicians are ready to start engaging with those questions. So it's almost like building those preconditions, building the appetite, and then at the time, the relationships with key decision makers, so that you're invited in and can sit around the table or go out for a coffee when we're allowed to do that with key individuals and propose these ideas, but also then bring the experts as well. The folks have got the really detailed knowledge. And I think actually, Jen, the first time we met in Stockholm was when I'd been speaking to some international relations theorists to get some ideas for how WeGo might actually operate. So really sort of leaning on that expertise, but also connecting it up. I think, I mean, you probably often folks here will know the work of Donella Meadows, and one of her pieces of advice is that people who will change the system are not those people who dive deep into one particular area of expertise. It's people who can dance with the system or surf the silos, as I often say. We need to learn to surf the silos, and that you can feel vulnerable of that, because it means you don't necessarily have expertise, deep expertise in any one area, but just to really encourage folk to embrace that ability to make those connections and build those relationships. And I guess the other point experience, and I think this might be a challenge to some, it feels challenging to me, it's something hard to hold, is the pragmatism that you sometimes need to meet audiences where they are and to think about the arguments that they'll find most compelling. And so to give you an example of that, we're working on a piece at the moment that we used to describe as the fiscal benefits of a wellbeing economy. We're now calling it counting the avoidable demands. And as I was saying earlier, with this idea of failure demand and ecological defensive expenditure, the current system that we have, the current economic system, incurs a lot of costs because it creates a lot of collateral damage. And so those costs show up in government spending lines when they're trying, and very inadequately, but they're trying to sort of respond to that collateral damage. So here in the UK, a huge amount of the welfare budget, the social protection budget, gets spent on topping up the wages of people who are in work. So essentially, this is the government subsidizing employers who don't pay their workers enough to put food on their families' tables. Housing benefit is another huge chunk of government expenditure, because the housing market is so plagued by rent seeking that people, everyday workers, can't afford to live in the areas where they're working. And so you have a huge amount of housing benefit. And again, this is like an onion. I mean, everyone, once you start listening to the news with this perspective, you'll see examples of this everywhere. All the spending on security guards and defense, a lot of prescription drugs, remedial education, maybe even a lot of accident and emergency treatment. There's a lot of spending that's ultimately avoidable. And so we can tally that up, and we can start to make put a price tag to that. And I think this is a really compelling argument to, for want of a better term, the bean counters. And I can see when I've talked to government officials in treasury departments or in the finance departments, when you talk about the need for change in these terms, something they're sort of calculators in their brain click. Now, why I say I'm a bit hesitant around it, because this is almost making the business case for change. And I've always rolled my eyes, is probably the politest term, when I hear, for example, the IMF saying we need to reduce gender inequality because gender inequality is bad for growth, or the World Bank saying we need to address poverty because poverty is a drag on growth. That always, that's really, I think that's problematic. We should do those things because they're the right things to do, not because they contribute to growth. So hence the sort of squeamishness. We need to be careful with this framing. But I do think we don't have time to not meet audiences where they are, when those. And so it's things like the Avoidable Demand Project. It's not the point, but it's the possibility. So that would be the other, I guess, lesson is to be pragmatic, but to do so carefully. I don't know if that even, I hope that makes a bit of sense. But I could see that, it's something you need to be careful with. But I think it's also, I can see how effective it is in bringing people to this conversation who may otherwise have not come to that discussion.
Yeah, no, and I. The reframing of the economy in the face of this larger sustainability context is always a tricky thing to do. But I think that by framing it in fiscal terms, the way that you just described, almost brings to the surface the tension of these social and ecological costs with GDP, right? Because even those fiscal costs contribute to GDP. So it's like the negative externalities, all of that still contributes to GDP. But if we say, okay, but what about public budgets, and where are we going to get the money to actually keep subsidizing, for instance, these profit maximizing firms, then I think you bring the tensions to the surface in a really useful way. So I think you guys are doing great work with that.
Exactly. And of course, GDP doesn't encourage prevention. It doesn't reward societies when people are kept healthy and safe in their communities. And so I don't know if it's the same in Sweden, but here in the UK, you so often, I mean, coronavirus pandemic, exceptional circumstances notwithstanding, which is a massive acute need, and perhaps we can come back to the implications there. But so often since I've been living in Scotland, every election campaign, you hear the politicians saying, under my watch, there'll be 1,000 more police on the beat. There'll be 1,000 more nurses. Imagine if we could have politicians saying, under my watch, there'll be 1,000 fewer police, because people were safe and felt safe in their communities. I mean, one of our board members in the We All Scotland Hub, who's this brilliant community activist called Tam, that we've just had a huge hospital built in Glasgow called the Queen Elizabeth. And Tam looked at that and he says, Katherine, see that hospital there? That's 8 stories high. Maybe in a wellbeing economy, it would only need to be 3 stories high. And I think that just so profoundly captures how much of our systems are set. And, as Herman Daly would say, this is uneconomic growth. This just, we're spending because of the damage we've created. And as I said, it's stupid, in the politest term. It's really silly. We can do better. And we're in a society where we've created, vaccines in record time. We've a society that is, cares for each other and has created mutual aid groups, and that all the wisdom and intelligence of societies these days. Surely it's not beyond us to understand the difference between means and ends of economic growth and engage in these conversations.
Exactly, yeah. And actually, so this brings us to one of the questions that came up in the chat, because what I think that we're talking about here is getting into like root causes and the systemic issues, right, that cause all of this. And Osa in the chat asks, how would you describe the driving forces of the present day economy? And I guess, of course, what's your lens on that?
Mm-hmm. Oh, also, I'd love to hear your thoughts too, because of course there's many driving forces pushing around the way the economic system is currently set up. We could have a conversation around rent seeking. We could have a conversation around money creation. And for each of these, you probably want to invite the relative expert to come and speak and give you a potted history. We could have a conversation about the institutionalization of gross domestic product in national accounting, in the Bretton Woods systems, in the European Union's Growth and Stability Pact, in the minds of the media as well, just how entrenched the media is into the mainstream media in terms of thinking about the success of a politician is really, can they get the economy growing again? You hear that with debates about recovery from COVID. It's about how can we get growth again? So there's that imagination mindset perspective as well. We could have a conversation about political capture as well. I think this is a really important discussion, just that confluence between wealth and power, and how so often those who have got more than their fair share of resources are able to influence the rules of the game in their favor. So I don't know if you hear this phrase a lot, Jen, in your work, but often I hear people saying the economy is broken. I profoundly disagree with that. I think the economy that we had going into COVID-19 was doing exactly what it was designed to do, and that was enable extraction of wealth up to those folks who've already got wealth. So we can have a conversation about that. I also think there's a conversation around just how that, the lack of people, linking up and collaborating with each other. And there are the solutions out there. There are the ideas out there of what a different economy looks like. I don't think we're short of that. I think what we're missing is these sort of power bases that we're trying to build at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance to help push for change and create a vanguard for change. So I think it's also a conversation around how activists and movements work as well. And I also think it's a conversation around our lack of imaginations. Back in 1983, Ronald Reagan said there's no limits to growth because there's no limits to our imagination and human ingenuity. And I think now, 30 or so years on, I think it's our collective imagination that stops us being able to think about the possibility that we could have an economy that's better than growth. So I think there's almost, I forgive this terribly geeky term, but our sort of narrow cognitive bandwidth that keeps us stuck. And so all the solutions are within the growth mindset. So we talk about inclusive growth or green growth or decarbonized growth or shared growth, et cetera, et cetera. But it just shows we're really stuck. And yet, as I said, there are solutions out there and there are the ideas out there, but they're just disconnected. Hence why this movement needs to sort of link up a little bit more and join up and add value to each other's work.
Yes, and I mean, I don't know if you get the same sense, but I get the sense that we're experiencing a sort of collective opening of minds happening. I mean, especially with the pandemic and the financial crisis of 2008, more and more people have become less and less comfortable, and that kind of opens people's minds up to alternatives. Another question that came up from Elizabeth in the chat, really, really good one and really central to the debate, is how do we counter the argument that growth is needed for development? That the driving force to get rich is what is driving development and innovation and this whole narrative around development and growth.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think we need to separate growth and development out. So what's improvement in terms of, say, for example, there's this social progress index, if folks have seen it, and it's an initiative from statistical colleagues at a group called the Social Progress Imperative, and they've taken about 53 different measures of what they define as social progress, and you can quibble with what's in there, but there's things that are pretty intuitive, and there's all sorts of other initiatives that do something similar, and they map that on the y-axis, and then they map GDP per capita along the x-axis, and what they show is at early stages of economic development, so when GDP per capita is going up, it is linked to a benefit in terms of that social progress index. Now, I think the key thing is it's not growth in and of itself. So you can see rising growth in places like Nigeria, where poverty goes up at the same time, or you can have growth in the UK, where you get huge levels of insecure work and all the other social progress indicators going down. The key thing is what that growth is used for. So there are some localities in the world, probably in Sweden, certainly in Scotland, there are some localities that do not yet have enough. But that conversation is one of distribution and cherishing and making the most of resources. So it's a much more complicated question around the quality of that growth and the distribution and how it's created as well. But I do think at a macro sense, there's a profound point that some of the wealthiest countries in a GDP sense need to make ecological room for basically so we can uphold the right to development, so that material living standards can increase in countries that I used to work with when I was working at Oxfam.
You've gone muted somehow.
What I think Elizabeth might be getting at, and Elizabeth, do come in and correct me if I've misunderstood your question, but I think that it's almost this lazy assumption that you so often see from commentators around the economy or development practitioners even, that would grow the economy and all the things that we're really interested in will naturally fall out from that. So the assumption is that we grow the economy and we'll have good jobs and we'll have better homes, more secure livelihoods, let alone dignity and purpose in our work, let alone, protected, flourishing, thriving local environment. And so, I mean, Manfred Max Neef, who, Jen, I think we share an affection for, he talks about pseudo-satisfiers. And it's almost like GDP has become our pseudo-satisfier. What is it societies are really after? Decent livelihoods, knowing that those they care about are safe, health, being able to participate in society. And instead, we've got economic systems designed in a way to try to satisfy those needs. They reach for more and more GDP growth. And then that, as we were talking about, that creates a problem itself. So Elizabeth, how to counter that argument, I think, is just to start asking those questions. There's also, you often get the response of, yeah, but growth has lifted millions out of poverty. It hasn't in and of itself. What's happened is when there have been poverty reductions, it's because collective institutions have been invested in. But also there's an argument you could counter with, if you look at the ethical poverty line, which is a slightly more ambitious measure of income poverty that links to life expectancy is declining, then you actually see that poverty has gone up in the last few decades. I mean, it'd be a whole other conversation, but just look in the search engine for the ethical poverty line. So you can even in its own terms, even in those own arguments, growth is failing.
Yeah, and Elizabeth wants to say something as well, and I might chime in as well after you're done, Elizabeth, because there's an interesting.
I just wanted to detail a thing that I'm struggling with, and that it's the people say that we want innovation. We would just be like in the old ages had we not had the driving forces to get rich for people to innovate and do things. And I truly don't believe in that. I think people would innovate for other reasons, but I don't really have the argument on how to respond to that. So I wonder if there is something you could just give me something to say. I mean, I'm so sure that people would try to better their lives just for other driving forces, but I don't know how to spell them out.
I hear that too. I get that a lot as well, Elizabeth. And people say, well, of course, we just need that greed imperative because that's what people respond to. That's when they're entrepreneurial, and that's where, as you say, they're innovative and they create new things, and that's what drives people on. That's the assumption that goes behind that mantra. And yet we know that we see humans being creative when they're caring for each other, when they're cooperating, and we've seen that in the response to the pandemic. I mean, one of my favorite examples is we saw some of the whiskey distilleries here in Scotland completely park their profit-making imperative, and these are publicly listed companies, profit-making imperative, completely park it, turn their production to making hand sanitizer that they were distributing to all public health centres at cost or for free. And so very creative, very innovative, very adaptive, not out of their profit imperative. And we did see the good, the bad and the ugly of the private sector response during COVID. And I think what's beautiful is when you see humans coming together to cooperate. And I think there's plenty of examples probably in your community of people cooperating and acting out of compassion and care for each other and being creative in doing so. So I'd lean on those.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I truly believe also that the cooperation and the being together and co-creation between people is really a driving force. But it's hard to reach those people who just said the only driving force is to get rich.
Yeah. There's also a lot of interesting research around how, for instance, with vaccines and medical innovation, most of that is done by public funded universities, right? And then the private sector comes in and takes those innovations out to market. But the innovation is funded and motivated by public institutions. Mm-hmm. So that, I think there's a lot of interest. And if you think back historically, why do we have light bulbs? It wasn't the profit motive that caused people to invent light bulbs and roads and all of these other things. It was, we are natural problem solvers and creative. One other thing I wanted to arm you with is that the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights last summer pointed out in this really bold statement that, economic growth is failing us. And it's the last few decades of economic growth have only served to make the wealthiest wealthier, and the poor people of the world have been left in poverty. And so when you have somebody in that kind of position, and I've heard that the new UN Rapporteur on Human Rights is even more stern about economic growth and development. So I think there's a gem for you to bring into discussions.
Yeah, thanks. And also the UN Rapporteur on Poverty Reduction. So was a chap called Philip Austin, and it's now a chap called Oliver De Schutter. And some of his tweets, I actually have screenshot and I use them in some presentations because he's just really very powerful. Also reading Akam Steiner, who's head of the UN Development Department, UNDP, his preface to the most recent UN Human Development Report is really, really, really powerful in terms of human development within the Anthropocene era, within the era where humans are the dominant impact on the planet. And he talks about, yes, some progress has been achieved, but it's also come at great cost. And he points to the fact that we value what we measure rather than measuring what we value. I'd say actually this is more another conversation, but I think almost in countries like Sweden, the UK, the measurement conversation's moved on. It's now, how do we put these into practice and change the economic system accordingly? But really worth dipping in, because then you can be quoting, as Jen said, from the UN. There's and the OECD is doing incredible work on this as well.
Yeah, true. And that's part of this larger mind shift I think we're seeing right now, and it's picking up pace the way that I see it. Okay, so we've got a lot of questions now, and I feel like I'm not doing a good job of moderating them. So I want to do them in the order that I noticed, which Morten Vestberg first, and then there was Stig Ulof, and then I think Ulla, who has his hand up, can go. So let's go in that order. Morten.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I love your analysis on the flip sides of the money-focused measurement system, and I'm thinking that that any which way you choose to measure, there's gonna be flip sides. Like a lot of the happiness researchers point out that if you focus too much on happiness, people are starting to think, no, I'm not 100% happy. My life's shit because I'm not 100% happy. And so that type of flip sides, what do you think about the system that you're suggesting?
So Martin, this is an excuse for me to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, is around how can we find better measures of progress? Because you're right, some of them all have perverse incentives that it may not be apparent initially. Another conversation we could have, actually, so I'm happy to come back if you'd have me another time, is around the happiness and too narrow focused on individual subjective well-being and the limits of that approach. But we see there are a lot of beyond GDP initiatives out there. I mean, one scholar's described it as the Wild West, in terms of loads of more indices, different measures of progress. And if you're a policymaker, if you're a civil servant working in government, how do you grapple with these? And I think also a lot of the problem is that they start as very well-intentioned initiatives that are wanting to help make the world a better place, wanting to measure and put a spotlight on what's most important to communities and to the planet. And yet they become very quickly technical translations, and they're the realm of weightings and dashboards and indicators. And and most normal people, when they're talking about dashboards and indicators, they're talking about their car, not their quality of life. And so you lose that connection to the original audience. And so I have this sort of dream project, Martin, where we'd come up with, I don't know, maybe half a dozen what I describe as cornerstone indicators that had to pass two tests. One, they would correlate with multidimensional well-being, various measures of what's important in people's lives and for the planet. But the other test they'd have to pass is that they made intuitive sense to everyday people, so that then everyday people would demand their politicians pay attention to this. And so the example I'll give to illustrate that is the number of girls who ride their bikes to school. So imagine if that number's going up, all sorts of important things are in place around adequacy of income for the parents, safe streets, local services, girls having breakfast probably before school, and so on. And maybe if you had, 5 or 6 other ones that correlated, then we can start to change the conversation. So that's my dream. Is I think it's now actually a communication question. It shows it's a maturing of that agenda too. I think, when the debates and the agenda's moving on, we now have to make sure we really put these into place and get them embedded in policy making. So if you think of any equivalents, let me know. If you think of your own favorite one.
Okay, so now we have Sachi, who I forgot to mention before, and then we'll go to Stig Olof, then Alexander, and then Ulla. We'll see how much time we have, because I'm going to have to cut it off. I'll give
short answers. I'm sorry.
No worries. Oh, Sachi, did you want to speak, or should I read your? Is Sachi even still here?
Maybe you can read it out.
Oh, okay. So related to your discussion on pragmatism, I would like to hear more about your reflections about the risks, tensions, and challenges of appealing to the mainstream, policymakers and business. Are there risks of the more radical potential of transformation becoming watered down or hijacked? Or your ideas being used for greenwashing? Or how do you see those risks?
Yes, there absolutely is a risk. And we're seeing here in Scotland where that feels quite acute at the moment. The word or the term wellbeing economy is really getting taken up by government and then by government agencies and by businesses and other groups, which, to be honest, such is really exciting. We're seeing this momentum and this sort of attention and people starting to pick up the language and the terminology. But I think that there's also that simultaneously and perhaps inevitably also comes with a sense that some folks will misunderstand it deliberately or accidentally and use it in slightly different ways. And I'm really loath to become the wellbeing economy definition police, but I have been a little bit, calling it out. So to give you an example, last summer, there was an advisory group commissioned by the Scottish government into economic recovery. And we got wind the day that this report was going to come out that it was going to be called Towards a Robust and Resilient Wellbeing Economy. So we were all really excited. We thought, this is great. This is powerful. This is a term getting right into the heart of government. And then we read the report and we were, oh dear. It talked a lot about wellbeing economy contributing to economic growth, which is sort of the IMF World Bank kind of approach, the business case for a wellbeing economy. So we wrote a pretty no punches pulled response. And the advisory group report was debated in the Scottish Parliament. And luckily we turned around that response fairly quickly, because what happened is one of the then Green MSPs, members of the Scottish Parliament, had read our report and so basically read it out into Parliament, our critique of that report. And so we have to call it out a bit. And you'll know with the term well-being, it's a really broad term, and it encapsulates some people's understanding of it, encapsulates areas that I think are quite counter. So often that emphasis on individual well-being, often the policy messages that come from that are around treatment, mindfulness, really sort of cope, toughen up, survive your circumstances better by changing your mindset or get some treatment. Whereas, and sometimes that's important because that's how you survive an inhumane system. But the wellbeing economy agenda is explicitly about system change. So we do have to call that out. But that's the flip side of a term being inclusive. And so it's a tension I think we just have to hold and be practical about and call it out when needed, but also not be too dogmatic, because we do want folks to feel included.
Yeah, and I can say, coming from like a post-growth and not-for-profit focus of my work, the well-being economy helps me build a bridge to other realms or other discussions. So Stig-Olof, it's your turn.
Well, maybe you can read it.
Surely I can. So Stig-Olof says, on the global level, we can see that countries with a low Gini index have the highest levels considering the index, the ecological footprint per person. How can we at the same time reach better economic equity and lower environmental impact on the global level?
Just in a couple of minutes. That's a question of our era, isn't it? That's massive. Did you say Gini as in inequality measure, Jen, or GDP?
No, Gini, yeah.
The Gini index describing the degree of equality. We have, for example, low Gini index in Sweden compared to South Africa, but in the same time, we in Sweden has the largest footprint per person almost in the world, while those in South Africa are very low. And for example, Thomas Piketty's research has shown that the Milton Friedman's idea about trickle down was not correct. In countries with more equal economy or equality between people, you got an increased growth, economic growth. But this economic growth causes also a large global damage. So in the same time, you get, well, it's a negative consequence of that. and how to combine it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of links between economic inequality and drivers of overconsumption on the world. And I'd urge you to look at two books. One, The Spirit Level by epidemiologist Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, who look at the sort of the inequalities and its sense of almost shame that that can impose on across people across the income spectrum, and how that leads to overconsumption of material goods because people are trying to keep up and show outwardly certain status. The other book that almost connects the arguments that to me I find really powerful is a small little book, I think it's 2002, called The High Price of Materialism, written by a psychologist, Tim Kasser, from Knox University in the States. And he very powerfully connects sort of materialistic attitudes with economic insecurity. And I read that book when I was doing my work looking at Glasgow's economic model. And Glasgow is proud to be Scotland's largest shopping destination. It's a city that's been designed over the last few decades around consumption and consumerism. You know, it's consumer citizen is the ideal citizen here in Glasgow. And I almost, when I was reading Kasser's work, replaced the word in individuals with Glasgow. And Glasgow is a city that's come through huge economic trauma over the last few decades and is now, as Kasser would say happens to individuals, very, very vulnerable to materialistic values. And so Stig, I think you'll really, really like those books. There's also work around the inequality makes it harder to build the sort of policy consensus around environmental measures. So yes, you're right to say some of the Nordic countries with their relatively low levels of economic inequality still have quite high material and environmental footprints. But I guess the hope would be that you're maybe better placed than some other countries to start to unpack that and pay attention to that because of the relatively low inequality. The other point, I'll be really quick, and I'm afraid because it's such a massive question, I'd love to talk more about it and hear your ideas as well, is the question around pre-distribution. So often social democratic consensus is let the market create its outcomes, and then the state comes in at 5 o'clock in the afternoon to redistribute, so tax and then welfare payments. Now, in a growing economy, you know, that's how it works. You sort of then, it's a state coming in, it's a sign of failure demand. And that, you know, that demands and relies on a growing economy. So it's a sign of uneconomic growth. I think part of the conversation that has to be inherent to discussions about a well-being economy and a post-growth economy is pre-distribution. How do we design market outcomes in ways that things are more equal just in the first time around, essentially? So these are things like worker cooperatives, where you have, you know, firms working for the benefit of their members, much less rent seeking, universal basic services, those sorts of questions. But I'd love to hear your thoughts another time.
Okay. Thank you for the answer. I have to go to another meeting now, so it's very, very nice to discuss.
Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I think that we could probably take one more and then just wrap up the main insights in a couple of minutes, because you gave such a lovely introduction and background for this. So, and I had forgotten that Svetlana posed a question before Alexander. So we're going to go with that, which is, could you please reflect a little on how decolonization is a part of creating the new ground for defining economic development? I honestly think that our Western way of defining progress needs to stop dominating the work of both NGOs and governments.
Yeah, good point, and entirely agree. And it's an ongoing challenge that, you know, anyone needs to be attentive to, and partly really being deferential and learning from wisdom from other non-Western ways of thinking. I'm particularly inspired by First Nations communities. Before I moved to Scotland 15 years ago, I did my PhD working with Aboriginal communities, and their ways of understanding relationship to the land, understanding collective engagement, I think really bodes well for, you know, wider economic systems. If we can learn from the, you know, 7th generation principle, I think there's so much to learn and to cherish in other worldviews. And I also think there's a lot, you know, very much to be inspired by things like, you know, Bren Vivier conversations around, you know, it shouldn't be about the bigger life, but the better life that's in harmony with nature, that puts gender equality at the forefront, and also why we hold the term wellbeing economy very, very lightly, because it doesn't translate everywhere. And I'm understanding is in some Scandinavian countries that wellbeing translates to welfare, for example. This is not what we'd say here, and you know, how would it, what would be the relevant, appropriate term for what we're trying to describe for social justice on a healthy planet. So you're really being gentle on the semantic side of things as well. But I think it's very much also about amplifying the voices of other scholars and other activists and other worldviews, and we're doing that a lot at the Wellbeing Economy. Definitely not enough, but we're really working hard on that. And if you, Spretslav, if you've got any ideas of particular people you'd like us to try to spotlight and amplify their work, please do connect them to the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. We've got a series of blogs recently with perspectives from other countries. Most recently, if we had one from a young person in Pakistan writing about what the Wellbeing Economy agenda meant to them, and so on, those sorts of things. But also scholars, we'd love to, you know, share reading lists and so on. So yeah, please help us do that.
Well, great. I think we need to start wrapping it up, and maybe just Toya mentioned that it's great to conclude these discussions with sort of a wrap up of key insights. So I wanted to ask you, Katherine, if you feel like sort of giving those key insights as a wrap up to the session.
Oh, I mean, I think it's thanks very much for the questions. I won't try and sort of summarize what we've said, because there's we've touched on a lot of different issues in terms of tactics and approaches to change, but also some of the content and how to engage people and different arguments to use. And I guess I just want to sort of, my final remark is just to encourage you all to feel very welcome to be part of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. It's a really diverse movement, and it's there to support people who are part of trying to, in your own way, in your own sphere of influence, in your own communities, trying to make the economic system more humane. And if you want to collaborate with others to do so, just then you're welcome to be part of WeAll. We have regular talks, members meetings, we connect and support each other's works, joint projects as best we can. So that would just, yeah, if I can do that little note of welcome and encouragement to be part of it.
Great. Yeah, and I was actually going to say, you know, most of us are in Sweden, and maybe we should start a Swedish well-being hub. You know, I think that's an exciting prospect for us to talk about in the Researchers Desk community. Oh, Toya gives us the thumbs up. I'd be happy to be part of that. But so let's just say thank you so much. There's tons of thank yous coming through in the chat. Thank you so much, Katherine. This was wonderful. It seemed everyone enjoyed it. I very much enjoyed it. I hope you did. And hopefully,
thanks everyone. Lovely to meet you all, and I hope we can stay in touch.
Yeah, maybe do it another time.
That'd be super. Super.
Take care.
Bye now.